I've long held that RPGs can in fact be the pinnacle of human art and expression. Now that sounds like hyperbole, but think about it. When running on all cylinders, it can encompass the vast and rich storytelling of literature, the beautiful art of painting, the quality cinematography of film, and the structures of architecture, the avant-garde designs of fashion, and the passionate compositions of an orchestra, heart-wrenching performances through motion capture and voice recording, and thoughtful and strategic or action-oriented gameplay mechanics. RPGs, man, they've got it all. Of course, not every game exemplifies the best of each of these things, but it's not a limitation of the medium. And the fact that so many of these phenomenal titles were made overseas doesn't help. It can't be easy to try to convey Shakespeare through a multilingual game of telephone. And yet, these games managed to touch our hearts and forge a whole generation of rabid RPG fans, either because of or in spite of the localization efforts of a few overworked and underpaid passionate individuals. We've experienced so many RPGs through the lens of localization teams, and that art, not science, is the oft unsung hero because when well done, the localizer disappears entirely. For instance, one of my favorite games of all time, Earthbound, was localized mainly by one guy, Marcus Lindblom, who infused Earthbound with his own quirky sense of humor because Japanese humor and puns rarely translate literally. And for this, his work is still celebrated to this day, and yet Americans praise Shigesato Itoi nearly exclusively when talking about the writing of Earthbound, even though most of us have never read a single kana from his pen. But, oh boy, make an unpopular choice and you'll never hear the end of it. As a counterexample to Lindblom, Working Designs is perceived as more of a mixed bag. While Vic Ireland also brought his own quirky sense of humor to the table, which was appreciated at the time, sentiment has gradually been shifting, and with the rise of AI-armed armchair experts, these rabid fandoms have become particularly ruthless and unrelenting. This video is focused on the games that had you asking, what exactly is a Spoony Bard, rather than getting upset over a word choice. And on that note, most of us are blessed to not have our day jobs play out in the public arena. You've probably never made a judgment call at work that brought upon you the wrath of the entire internet hate machine. So, as I talk about these games, please understand that I'm making this out of love for the games and the genre, and is not a call to action to be a dick. In fact, my only call to action is that if you are as passionate about RPGs as I am, hit that subscribe button because you'd be helping me out on my own passion-fueled quest to take this channel full-time. And with that said, these are the RPGs that deserved better. I'm kicking things off with the good news, the games that were done dirty at the start but have been saved by subsequent efforts. And I think that the poster child for this has to be the original Revelations Persona. The PlayStation 1 version was heavily altered and censored for the West, changing character names and faces and even races, cut out the entire roots of the game, and changed the dialogue to tone things down in an apparent attempt to make things feel more American. Fortunately, these mistakes were not repeated in the 2009 port of Persona to the PSP. This came with a completely reworked script faithful to the Japanese version, restored the cut content and names and faces, and the PSP localization fixed the stilted, Americanized tone of Revelation. And it is now the definitive way to play Persona 1 in English. And it also bears mentioning now that this PSP port was one of 3 that were made. We also got Persona 2 Innocent Sin this time around, which is an enhanced port or remake of a PS1 game that was previously never localized in the United States. It's an incredible little title that, in my opinion, features some of the best group dynamics exemplified in any RPG. But this video isn't really about RPGs that didn't cross the pond, it's about the ones that did, but arrived looking like they swam the whole way. Which leads perfectly into Persona 2 Eternal Punishment. We certainly got this one back when it was released on the PlayStation 1, but this was essentially part 2 of a game that we never got part 1 for. Despite that missing context though, this was still better received overall, somehow. The characters kept their Japanese name, the setting was recognizably Japanese, and the script wasn't censored for content. So at least from that perspective, it was a pretty faithful job. However, because this was more of a literal translation approach, the dialogue often felt stiff and stilted and awkwardly phrased. It lacked polish and natural rhythm. What should have been emotive storytelling beats came across as flat because of odd grammar and phrasing. Boss dialogue was also confusing due to Japanese idioms and phrases that didn't actually get adapted. This is a cautionary tale to anyone pining for a literal translation, because there is more than one way to skin a cat. But a literal translation of this sentence would have Japanese people thinking I'm talking about removing the pelt from a feline. For the record, for any Japanese viewers, I most certainly am not. Breath of Fire 2 was one of the first RPGs that I actually struggled hard to finish, and not because the game was bad or because of the encounter rate or anything like that, but because the dialogue was so absolutely mind-melting at times. While Capcom relied on the expertise of Squaresoft for the first localization of Breath of Fire 1, it seems that Capcom thought they'd save a few bucks by handling the follow-up in-house. After all, if they could localize Mega Man without any issues, why not hundreds of lines of dialogue? Ryu's hometown was literally called Hometown, for crying out loud, and things only go from bad to worse when Jean enters the stage, bringing along with him a French accent whose silliness is rivaled only by Jean Cleese. I apologize to all my French viewers. Unfortunately, the Game Boy Advance port somehow ended up getting the green light with the same script with only minor typo improvements, and well, I guess when I say somehow, I suppose we can just assume Capcom didn't want to pony up to have the job done properly. While Capcom still hasn't bothered to do this game justice to this day, we can at least still enjoy the Super Nintendo release through the efforts of Ryusui and their fan project. These efforts, in addition to translating the more accurate French script into Japanese, made other tweaks to the game's aesthetics, lifting visual components from the Game Boy Advance port, and is now considered to be the definitive way to play. Let's see if I pronounce it right this time, guys.
Suikoden
1 and 2 are beloved by fans, but their English text was infamously, well, let's not say bad, but simplistic and riddled with issues. The first game had a pretty simplistic translation, but
Suikoden
2 was even more error-ridden despite, or probably because of, its grander scope. Players encountered typos, truncated and nonsensical lines, and even leftover coding placeholders such as Message 30, which appears in one line of dialogue. In Suikoden 2, some NPCs spoke gibberish, and some character dialogue randomly shifts into third-person speech, a clear sign of a rushed job. One NPC cat even meows, "Sonia?" because the translator misinterpreted nya, the Japanese automatopoeia or word for meow. While these things didn't keep players from connecting with these titles in a deeply profound way, these issues brought down the game somewhat, and there wasn't really an alternative until recently. The HD remakes of Suikoden 1 and 2, while not perfect, have completely revamped the experience for English-speaking players. These remakes feature completely overhauled localizations, terminology between games has been unified, and many prior errors have been fixed. That said, there are still some glitches that remain, particularly in puzzle hints, but this still represents a significant upgrade in the translation quality, which when paired with the significant upgrade in most other ways, makes the HD remakes the current definitive way to experience these games. Now, I'll preface this with, while not the worst, the localization of Star Ocean: The Second Story, well, it wasn't great. And this game deserved greatness. In my review, I certainly gushed over how expansive and ambitious this game was, and somehow it managed not to crumble under its own weight. However, it could in fact be that sheer scope and scale of the game that worked against its localization team. Some character names and terms had to be altered or censored, such as the 10 Wise Men villain group that had its name changed. Now, some lesser people might bring up the voice acting here, but not me. The in-game shouting of names of various abilities is the kind of aged cheese that people would pay triple for at a Whole Foods, even if some people can't quite appreciate the full funk for what it is. That said, the PSP Star Ocean Second Story Evolution came west with a significantly improved translation, refining the dialogue and terminology. Reviewers noted that the script felt more natural and even adjusted character speech patterns to fit better their personalities. But even more recently than that, Square Enix released Star Ocean: The Second Story R, a gorgeous and modern remake that faithfully polishes the localization and adds dual audio, and that means Star Ocean 2, once known for its iffy PS1 script, now has a much more polished and official translation, and it's also way more widely accessible now. You know, this wouldn't be a real SuperDerek video if I didn't find some excuse to mention a quintet game. The Soul Blazer trilogy are some peak Super Nintendo action RPGs paired with middling Super Nintendo localizations. Illusion of Gaia, for example, was commissioned by Enix, it was localized and published by Nintendo, and while the actual content of that localization was fine, it's the things that had to be left behind that left everything feeling awkward. It suffered from abrupt tone shifts and some incoherent narration. The English script would sometimes switch between first and third person narration, but in late 2024, exactly 30 years later, a fan translator, L. Thami, released Illusion of Gaia Retranslated, a patch that closely follows the Japanese script. This new translation is far closer to the original and far better than the original 1994 version. Fans have praised it for finally making the storyline more comprehensible and restoring darker plot nuances that Nintendo left on the cutting room floor. As for official prospects though, it seems like Quintet's dissolution and Tomoyoshi Miyazaki's disappearance have left nearly all of these titles in the lurch, without much in the way of prospects for re-releases or remakes on the horizon. Honestly, I could fill this entire video with nothing but Squaresoft titles and call it a day. Games from the cartridge era were almost universally constrained by storage limitations. Say what you will about the final product, but at least these games were on a cartridge. But at what cost? Well, very little, apparently, because all of these games still remain some of the most beloved of the genre. The Final Fantasy series and Secret of Mana had a rough go at it at first. Even so, we all know that the game numbers were changed, and if they were willing to do that to the cover of the book, just imagine the horrors contained within. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest was a baby's first RPG for Americans because we clearly weren't capable of appreciating real RPGs, right? Well, kind of. It was certainly released first in the US, but before it was abandoned forever, the game did also come out in Japan for Japanese beginners too. And when it came to Final Fantasy IV, when it came into the US as Final Fantasy II, Squaresoft created a toned down version of Final Fantasy IV with simplified mechanics, missing abilities, weaker enemies, and reduced item complexity specifically for the American market. But they ended up adapting that version back to Japan again for Japanese beginners. Making the game easier during localization is kind of the opposite of what Working Designs was doing at the time, increasing the difficulty of games like Popful Mail and the Lunar games. Anyway, in the intervening years, Square Enix has gradually revised many of those early RPGs that had subpar English. The real Final Fantasy II and III finally got real English localizations in the 2000s, with excellent translations on platforms like Game Boy Advance and PSP and DS, and similarly, Final Fantasy IV and VI, originally released with heavily cut down scripts, were re-localized in later editions, such as on the Game Boy Advance and the Pixel remasters, restoring cut content and improving dialogue flow. Secret of Mana is another notorious example. Its initial translation was hampered by extreme text compression and cuts. Lines often felt disjointed or incomplete because, well, they were. In 2018, the Secret of Mana remake came with a fully retranslated script, making the story more coherent, but the remake itself kind of fell flat for fans who still felt like it could do better. And even though the Collection of Mana finally brought Trials of Mana to the West with a stellar localization, sadly the compilation did not touch the localization of the original Secret of Mana. Luckily for us though, fans made a relocalized patch that was created for the original Super Nintendo title, which updates and uncensors the script to be much closer to the Japanese intent, they say. Now that wraps up the good news that I have for you though, because the rest of the games on my list are still trapped behind the distortion and fuzz of rough localization. But if my recording time is anything to go by, I should probably save the rest for a part 2, which I'm going to have out for you next week. So get subscribed so you don't miss it, and I'll see you all in the next one. Have a great day, everyone.